invite the next panel to the stage, a panel of brilliant minds who are looking at the risks to the entire planet, to our whole system. And I'm delighted to introduce Andrew Gilmour, who is a trustee of the United Nations Association of the UK, also former UN Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights and the author of a book diagnosing the links between climate and conflict called The Burning Question. Over to you, Andrew. I look forward very much to the panel.
Thank you very much indeed. Please sit. When the visionary characters met here in 1946 in the rubble, the physical rubble, the emotional rubble, they had gone through the greatest planetary challenge of all time. And quite frankly, look, if they were here now looking at the nature of our planetary challenges, they would find it perhaps hard to recognize. Of course, they would get the conflict, they would get, unfortunately, the genocide, they would get the famine. But would they really understand, I suspect not, artificial intelligence? Would they understand the climate change? And would they understand the biodiversity crisis? Because these are collectively the massive crises of our time. Now, despite the fact, the enormity of these challenges, despite the fact that the devastating consequences of climate change, not least on the United States itself, it seems we are perhaps not exactly winning the debate. And it shouldn't even be a debate, given the intellectual academic consensus on this. But nevertheless, the denialism that we all see, the fact that there is even these rather paltry measures that have been taken so far, deeply inadequate, that there's a rollback against those as the populists use net zero as a so-called woke issue and a wedge issue. But nevertheless, and on top of that, we also have, I'm afraid, the savage cuts in foreign aid that have happened in several countries, not least the United Kingdom. But it really does not mean that we've exhausted all the options, and indeed, particularly if we are able to work in a concerted way in collaboration and cooperation internationally, as precisely what the UN is about, there is a chance. Now, we have 4 extremely qualified panelists here, and we're going to quickly go through some of the issues that I think will be of interest to everybody here. And I'm going to start, I'll introduce them as we come to them, Ajay Gambhir, who is the Director of Systemic Risk. Perhaps you, first of all, tell us what systemic risk is and how it relates to these planetary challenges.
Great. Thank you very much, Andrew. It's a real pleasure and privilege to be here and to open this panel. It's that time of year again when the private jets and helicopters are landing in Davos. And I think we all know what's coming next week. But one of the interesting things about this time of year is that the World Economic Forum seeks this opportunity to release its annual Global Risks Report. And the one that it published just 3 days ago, which includes a survey of 1,300 experts from across the world, highlights what they think are the key risks facing the world this coming year. Geoeconomic confrontation ranks first, followed by state-based armed conflict, followed by extreme weather events, then societal polarization, and then mis- and disinformation. Maybe not surprising, each of those risks equally daunting, but just think about the interconnections between those risks. It probably doesn't need too much of a stretch of the imagination to think about a scenario in which extreme weather destabilizes crops. This might compound with existing conflict to accelerate migration out of a region. That could strain international relations if there is an influx of migrants into other regions which hasn't been planned for or anticipated. That could polarize societies and open the door to mis- and disinformation. You've heard about compounding and cascading risks and crises there, and that is systemic risk. This is the kind of risk that my organization, the Accelerator for Systemic Risk Assessment, which is an independent non-profit hosted by the UN Foundation, spends its time thinking about. And we've concluded that we need new approaches to assessing and responding to these highly coupled, interconnected risks. So that's clearly a challenge. How do we go about it? Well, we've learned from a huge variety of initiatives across scales and sectors and across risk types. Take the humanitarian and disaster response sector, about which we've heard quite a lot already today. They have proven adept at not just responding to, but anticipating crises involving multiple risks, including natural hazards such as earthquakes or famines or disease or floods and other extreme weather events. We've seen examples of cash transfers before floods hit in South Asia so as to protect households, chlorination of water as cholera outbreaks were spotted to try and stem them successfully in many cases in Southern Africa, and the distribution of animal care kits before extreme weather hit in East Asia, just across the last decade. And so we've seen a successful shift from reactive response to anticipatory foresight. And those are the kinds of examples that we're looking at. They give us a blueprint for not just local action, but for national, regional, and international action. Take national risk assessments, which every, or at least most countries do to catalogue all of the different risks facing them. They're becoming increasingly sophisticated, yet they still tend to not be able to take into account the compounding, cascading implications of those risks. We've seen the European Commission's Joint Research Centre last year explicitly take on that challenge and look at feedback loops, causal loop diagrams, and compounding and cascading effects. But we need to go beyond any one region, and we need international coordination around early warning systems, standards for terminology, data and evidence, and ways of forecasting and doing anticipatory foresight. Such initiatives need spearheading and guidance by multilateral governance. And as I come to a close, that's what gives me optimism and hope. I think that these joint needs across countries and regions to address, anticipate, respond to what are planetary scale risks is what will reignite trust in a geopolitically fragmented world. Climate change, biodiversity loss, disease, unregulated technologies, and all of those things you've heard about, they don't know international barriers. And I think that's a huge opportunity, therefore, for common approaches which will help, I think, to regenerate cooperation according to the original UN principles. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll come back to the end. I'll follow. Rachel Kyte was the UN Special Representative on Climate and is now the UK Special Representative. Rachel, you were at Belém, the last COP. Where exactly are we in the sort of multilateral climate negotiations?
194 countries minus one is 193. It's not zero. And while clearly the tensions and the instability that we all wake up to every morning takes a lot of the mind space and the head space from political leaders as they try to navigate through a new attack on free trade, on international law, on the way in which we have built cooperation over the last 50 years, really, when it comes to environment and sustainable development. Those 193 that are still in are working through the very difficult part of the process of trying to meet the temperature goals that we've set in the Paris Agreement and trying to live up to the other part of the Paris Agreement, which often gets overlooked, which was that we would leave no one behind. And it's complicated stuff, because what we are doing is taking ourselves off a fossil fueled economic system to a system where we will electrify, we'll change the source of energy, electrify everything, in the process of electrifying everything, democratize energy and the services that it provides. And that's hard. A, because we've never done it before. B, because we have a profound amount of money going into disinformation and misinformation about why this is a bad thing. You've got vested interests, you've got inertia, and you've got, I think, a system which is short-term in its politics while long-term in its impacts. So the good news from Belém is this wasn't a conference where there was a big leap forward. We weren't really negotiating anything. What we were trying to do is work out how to work together to speed up action. And I think despite the fact that there were clearly headwinds outside of the room and in the room, you know, the show is still on the road, 193 is still in, everybody knows what they've got to do, and we know how much money we kind of have to mobilize. The question is now, are we good enough to do it? But I think that and the Paris Agreement is 10 years old, and it has worked, it's just not worked well enough and for enough people. And I think it's in that space then the naysayers make hay. And so if this is a session about the to-do list, and you're all here and not watching Tottenham versus West Ham, you know, I mean, then I think we should talk about what we're all going to do together. And I think it's really important to bring Belém home. So you can sit in the pub, or you can, you know, sit in a classroom and ask yourself, why is going all the way to Belém important to my electricity bill, to my food bill, to my sense of security, to whether or not I feel safe? And that's an absolutely legitimate question. And the answer is that if we lose the Congo Basin, the Amazon, and the Southeast Asian canopies, your food is insecure. You will not be able to not only afford a basket of essentials, they will not be on the shelves for you to purchase. If we cannot find a way to move ourselves to a clean energy system and to cooperate on the minerals and metals that that clean energy system needs, we will not be energy secure. We know what happens when oil prices hike. We can't have that happen to the electrified systems of the future. And if we cannot find a way to provide affordable, reliable, and therefore clean, because that is the cheapest, quickest way to provide affordable and reliable energy to the millions of people who still do not have it, as well as water and sanitation, then that will undermine the processes of democracy, the processes of peace. It will then spur more conflict, and it will spur more migration. And so that whole conversation about feeling secure again is back to where we start. And so I think that we've got much more to do to explain why, you know, 50,000 people going to Belém matters here, and why what we do here and how we posture ourselves as the British government matters to those 50,000 people in Belém. So Belém, no big jumps forward, but the show is on the road, we're all together, and there's more of us than there are of them, and we've got some very hard work to do over the coming years.
Thank you. I'll come back to you, Rachel, I'll come back to you. Carl Skau, former senior Swedish diplomat, now deputy head of the vitally important UN World Food Programme. We are seeing a time, I mentioned the cuts, and of course the United States cuts are massive. We've seen, and I think never before, we've seen 400 UN and aid staff being killed in Gaza by the Israelis, and in under 2 years. You have referred recently to a perfect storm facing the humanitarian community. Could you expand a little bit on that and explain a little bit what you mean?
No, sure, Andrew, and thank you. And let me just begin by saying how exciting and inspiring it is to, as a UN staff, to be here on a Saturday with so many from the public showing up to mark this important moment and to listen to challenges, but also to discuss solutions. So really, thank you to all. I don't know if it's Tottenham's playing, but I know there is a Manchester derby at the same time. So really, really grateful for that. No, the perfect storm. I mean, we're being hit from all sides, frankly. But let me highlight 3 aspects. The first one, hunger is at historic level. In 5 years, we have seen a tripling of the number of hungry. And when I talk about acutely hungry, that means that you don't know where the next meal is going to come from. We're now at some 300 million people. I mean, if that was a country, that's a massive country. And that means that, behind those numbers, there are individuals, there are families, there are women, there are children. Last year, we had 2 famines. That have not happened before. 2 famines confirmed in Gaza and in Sudan. And so historic levels of hunger that is driven by conflict, not least, but also compounded by climate shocks and other economic shocks. Secondly, the funding is plummeting. WFP saw a cut of 40% of our funding last year at these historic levels of needs and demand. We had to let go of some 5,000 of our staff, but more importantly, we have cut many millions of hungry off our assistance. In Afghanistan, we've gone from assisting some 10 million people to around 2 million people, and we know now during the winter, not being able to be there and assist, children are dying as a result of those cuts. Thirdly, it's never been more difficult or more dangerous to be a humanitarian. You referred to record number of humanitarians being killed. We right now have 38 of our WFP staff detained in northern Yemen by the authorities there for no other reason than being part of the UN and humanitarian family. And so we're seeing increased obstructions, either as a tactic of war or as a collateral. And of course, access is a big issue. In Sudan, we have famine-confirmed areas in northern Darfur and in the Kordofan where we are not able to access. These towns, Kadugli in the Kordofan, El Fasher, as you probably have heard of in northern Darfur, have been sealed off, as a method of war, and people are starving to death without our access. So these are forces coming together. Of course, we are adapting and we are responding. We are aiming to reach some 100 million people this year. In Sudan, every month, we are reaching 5 million, 2 million of those in the hardest to reach areas. And since the ceasefire came about in Gaza, we have reached 1.5 million people every month, providing food, hot meals, bread. So what I wanted to send, while there is a tough, we were hoping, we had a kind of a New Year's wish that 26 would be better than 25, because all our humanitarians said 25 was the hardest year on record. Certainly hasn't started off on a good way. But I want to also say that there is hope. I mean, we are making a difference. And since Rachel also was speaking to why does this matter, I mean, I think it is evident there is a moral obligation. I think we all agree that children cannot starve to death. That is something we need to act upon. But obviously, fundamentally also, food security relates to stability in any given context. And Europe is not an island. In the Sahel, in the Horn of Africa, in the Middle East, hunger is fundamentally destabilizing societies. Because when you're faced with hunger, you have basically 3 options. It's you rise up or take arms, you move, or you starve to death. And that's what we're seeing increasingly now also as a result of the deep cuts that we're facing.
Right. But other than the financial part, can I ask you, I mean, because it seems to be a deeply troubling phenomenon to see the systematic targeting of UN staff, who are, of course, they're out there implementing the mandates that have been given to them by member states, and yet one hears very, very little about that from member states. What more can they do, do you think, to try to stop this troubling phenomenon before it gets even worse?
Well, thanks for drawing attention to that, and you mentioned Gaza, but I mean, in Sudan, we have lost some 7 colleagues in the past year.
How many?
7, where we are on a convoy where we tried to push through the besiegement of El Fasher, had 4 of our drivers hit when we had determined that let's try to push through despite the fact that we didn't have the clearances. The same in the Kordofans. We lost 3 of our drivers to a convoy last year, and there has been no attention whatsoever to that. I mean, the fact that we have 38 colleagues who are spending every night in cells in Sana, the fact that that is not, mobilizing world outrage is painful to me, and certainly something that keeps me up at night. You asked what to do. I mean, I think, this is the basics of international humanitarian law. And so, members of the Security Council, needs to speak up and they need to take action. And ultimately, there needs to be a price, accountability. There is a sense of impunity out there when the rules-based order is fundamentally challenged. We see it on a daily basis. We kind of live it at the checkpoints, on the front lines. And so, I really call on member states, particularly member states on the Council, to make sure that there is a price to breach international humanitarian law and the safety of humanitarian. And of course, to apply these principles consistently. It needs to matter. I'll leave it to them.
Thank you. Derek Walker, you are from Wales. You're the Commissioner for Future Generations. Can you tell us a little bit what that entails and what you're trying to do and what you are doing?
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. Prinanda Pau, good afternoon. You're all probably wondering what that guy from Wales is doing on the platform when we have such a distinguished international panel. Well, I think the answer to that is because Wales offers a model for long-term governance that can help us to implement the commitments in the important UN Declaration for Future Generations and the idea of a special envoy for future generations based on my role, or drawn and influenced by my role. Everyone agrees, I think, or when I go around Wales doing my job, the public are supportive of action to tackle the global planetary risks. They want us to take action to restore nature. They want us to take action to mitigate the impact of the climate emergency. But too often we put this in the category of it's impossible to do. Governments can only possibly look to the next election or the next budget. But what we've done in Wales is put in place a piece of legislation called the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which mandates our public sector to look to the long term and achieve long-term goals. It can sometimes feel a little bit abstract to people that I talk to. My job as Future Generations Commissioner, not everyone gets that. But the concept is simple, and I talk often about my niece Erin. My niece Erin lives in South Wales, where I was brought up. She's 12. She loves playing soccer and football. She hates any sort of vegetable. Well, clearly I want her to have a good life, a good education, a roof over her head today. But I also want her to have a happy and healthy life in 50, 60, 70 years when I'm no longer around. So this is about embedding an approach to long-term governance and making it part of the everyday culture of decision-making. So what we did in Wales back in 2015 is we agreed this legislation, the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. It was done in parallel to the agreement of the Sustainable Development Goals at the UN level. And I think, well, we think we were one of the first, perhaps the first country to have legislated for the Sustainable Development Goals. It was done through a national conversation called the Wales We Want conversation, which involved the people of Wales in talking about the future that they wanted. And that's helped to put down some firm foundations for this legislation. And we agreed 50 indicators, long-term indicators for success, on which we report every year to tell the people of Wales whether we're delivering or not on the goals and the ambitions they set for our country. And they created my job, an independent Future Generations Commissioner, the only one, perhaps one of the only ones in the world, independent of government, advocating for future generations. And I must say, it's the privilege of my life to be speaking up for those people and those generations not yet born. But has it made a difference? Thank you. But has it made a difference? Well, it's my job to be impatient about the pace of change, and there's certainly lots more that we can and should be doing in Wales. But when you look at some key decisions and policies over the last 10 years, you can see the impact of having this legislation in place. It applies to the Welsh Government, but it also applies to our health boards, it applies to our fire services, and it applies to our national parks. So take transport, for example. we know we've got to change the transport system. And a crucial first landmark decision for this legislation was turning down an investment in a new motorway in South Wales. It would have saddled future generations with a debt of £1.4 billion and would have cost an important area of nature. That didn't happen because of this law, and this law then led to an ambitious new transport strategy, which is hoping and planning to get us to 2045, when 45% of our journeys will be cycling, walking, or on public transport. And that change, thank you. And we've got a long way to go. If you go to Wales now, you won't see a transport system yet that's fit for future generations. But we've invested heavily in public transport and in public safety. And so our controversial 20 miles per hour speed limit saved 100 lives and serious casualties in its first year. And we are seeing the lowest levels of casualties on our roads since records began in 1979, all inspired by doing the right thing for future generations. Similarly, we saw last year a 20% increase on Transport for Wales Railway. So big stuff happening in the name of this legislation. Got many other examples, and I won't go through them all, but just let me take you to waste. In Wales, if you go to waste, you go and see our waste system, you'll see a difference than you see elsewhere in the UK. We are second in the world in terms of our recycling rates, and we're very proud of that. But it's not just thinking about needing to recycle and reducing waste for future generations. This law also requires our public bodies to think in an integrated way and look beyond silos. How can they maximize their contribution to all of our 7 goals, not just to one of them? So in putting together a waste strategy, they're also looking at how they can build more cohesive communities, put facilities in communities run by communities, and also support the Welsh language. So it's fantastic to see that sort of creative thinking inspired by this legislation. So it's really, I'll just wind up by saying it's a great model hidden in plain sight right here in the UK, and can be an important model for inspiring other countries to put in similar approaches around the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask all 4 panelists, actually, if you could answer the following question. If there was one thing you would like to see either this amazing audience that has come on a Saturday or the United Nations to really do one thing, Ajay, what would you like this audience to take away from this meeting?
It's a big question. I'll have to answer that in self-interest, I think. I think what I've been busying myself thinking about for the last 2 or 3 years since I guess, graduated from being a climate scientist to a systemic risk scientist is trying to raise awareness of how, as we've heard, everything is interconnected. So I think previous panelists and speakers talked about better joining up across UN departments, and I would really advocate strongly for some kind of UN coordinated mechanism which brings countries together to much more visibly see and surface these risk interconnections. Just to repeat, I think what I said on the panel, I think that will prove a very strong motivating force to regenerate this international cooperation. We have treaties, we have brilliant treaties, Paris, Montreal, Kunming, Montreal. We are addressing and trying to address our planetary challenges around climate change, ozone, biodiversity loss. But if we start seeing the interconnections, both across risks and across scales, I think that will be a big, strong motivating force for cooperation. So I'd love you to take that away and advocate for that with me.
Thank you. Rachel.
Building on that, I talked about the sort of the theory of change, right? We get our energy system working, we run everything off a clean energy system, we stop deforesting. The third part of that is that we change our financial system. The financial system today, the international financial architecture that was created alongside the UN, it still makes it possible for us to see more finance leaving small island states and the most vulnerable countries in debt service payments than any of the aid transfers or the climate finance or anything else that we're investing in those regions. These countries also happen to be on the front line of climate impacts. It is impossible to build resilience if you are sending more money out than you are getting invested back in. And that is not anything other than the way that the rules of the international system work. Now, the UK was a proud founder member of the UN. We were also instrumental and proud founders of the IMF and the World Bank and the MDB system. And we have the know-how. We have, at times in the last 80 years, stood up and led the way, including the first time that we hosted the G20 under Gordon Brown, where we sort of put a new coalition together around debt. There is an expectation, not only because of our historic responsibilities, but because of our know-how, the fact that we do walk the talk in some of the areas that we've been talking about. We have started to decarbonize our economy effectively. The rest of the world wants to know how we did it, what are the institutions that make it possible to do, and until very recently, how did we have a bipartisan consensus around the fact that this was important to do, and we still have a statutory obligation to decarbonize and build resilience. And so I think that we have to tackle head on the fact that we were never going to be able to pay our way to a world that is more resilient and can adapt better by just using whatever percentage of GDP that was for overseas development assistance. Whether we were still at 0.5 or 0.7, that was never going to be enough. This is about changing the way that we value and we invest in the resilience of people, and it is going to be much cheaper to do it now, or in previous years it would have been even cheaper than it will going forward. This year is also the 20th anniversary of Lord Nicholas Stern's report on climate change in the global economy, where he said that the cost of inaction is so much higher than the cost of action. For 20 years, international financial leaders have broadly ignored that common sense. He now, in his most recent writing, has talked about the fact that investing in resilience, investing in systems that work, investing in clean energy, investing in being net zero is actually the greatest investment opportunity that we have in order to grow our own economy. I think the further you go away from the eastern seaboard of the United States, the further east and south you go, you see evidence of that. And you see evidence of that here in some of the domestic policies. But that has to become now our mantra. And it's time for us to make sure that we've got financial systems that direct capital to where it's needed and don't reward the short-term benefits of some of what the market responses are. So this is work for us all to do.
Thank you.
No, I think my key message would be that historic levels of hunger and the humanitarian work is really, really tough, historically tough. But we are making a huge difference. And the UK has a very important role to play. Like on climate action, they have been a leader on humanitarian action over the past decades, and we want the UK to remain that leader. So an appeal would be that to keep the engagement and the attention on global issues. I know there are many, many domestic pressing issues that are legitimate. I know there are many pressing issues also in the neighborhood, not least around Ukraine, that are legitimate to pay attention and invest resources in. But the global issues also need your engagement and your attention.
Well, my response would be, of course, around the Future Generations agenda. We've heard a number of times the UN Charter quoted and referring to saving succeeding generations from the scourge of war. Well, my ask is for the UN to continue on this path. We agreed a couple of years ago, I was in the room, the UN Declaration on Future Generations. We absolutely need to see that implemented. It created global momentum as a result of that declaration to see countries, but cities and regions and subnational organizations taking action for the long term. So we need to see that implemented, in particular, the Special Envoy for Future Generations. That role could be an important catalyst for pushing forward on this agenda and making connections for those of us who who are trying to implement action for future generations around the world.
So I think it's really no exaggeration to say that the planetary challenges that are confronting us at the moment have never been greater at any point since 1946. And at the same time, the need for support for the United Nations as UNA UK and its partners elsewhere in the world has never been more important. So, but I would like to thank all four panelists for some really quite inspiring ideas. I said we're not out of options, and they've kindly given us a number of solutions that I think we should be pressing for. Thank you.